Everyone, and good morning. It's Travis, and thanks for joining me for a discussion about two great saints, Saint Oscar Romero and Saint Josephine Bakhita. These two individuals came from immensely different places and vocations, yet their lives reflect a depth of courage, compassion, and faith. In the next few minutes, I want to tell you about their lives, why they are significant to the church and to the wider world, and how they embody such strong motives, such as devotion to justice, forgiveness, and service. My prayer is that when you are finished, you won't just know them better, but you'll desire your own faith, your own life, to be differently lived as well. So we'll begin with Saint Oscar Romero. He was born in 1917 in El Salvador, which is a small Central American country, which at the time was packed with political unrest and poverty. And Oscar was born into a poor family and was a priest. He was very wise and thoughtful, and in 1977 became San Salvador's archbishop. At first, he was perceived as quiet and conservative, but something went through him when his priest friend, who was actively engaged among the poor, was killed by a shot fired by the regime. Romero just could not keep silent anymore, and then his voice came out very strongly in the defense of the poor and the suffering. Since he was the archbishop, Romero also preached to the country. He preached on the radio each Sunday, and everyone from everywhere in the country had heard him. He criticized the violence, the injustice, and the sufferings of the people in his sermons. He did not preach while standing at a safe distance, though. He went to the slums, he went to the villages of victims of political violence, and he asked the soldiers to listen to their conscience. His greatest popularity came when he went to the public and asked the military not to shoot civilians when he said, "No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God." This took an immense amount of courage, and he was threatened with death throughout, but he never failed. Fortunately, his bravery came at a cost. On March 24th, 1980, as he was celebrating a mass at a tiny chapel, Romero was shot and murdered by a contracted killer. He was literally at the altar preparing to elevate the bread and wine when he was shot down. It stunned the whole world. He was seen as the day's prophet who was murdered for his belief and for his nation. He was made a symbol of self-sacrifice, justice, and truth. It wasn't until 2018 when Pope Francis made him a saint, already a champion of faith that does justice. Romero continues to show us faith is a whole lot bigger than just going to church. It's about advocating for the widowed, about loving recklessly, and even about giving all of yourself up for what you believe in. Romero's memory continues to live on El Salvador and in the world. There are schools, churches, and movements named after him, and his memory continues to inspire others, particularly when they witness injustice. But let us now switch to a very different yet as inspiring character known as Saint Josephine Bakhita. Born around 1869 in what today is known as the nation of Sudan, Africa, she was abducted by slave merchants as a young girl and had walked 600 miles and possibly more. Whipped and abused and sold numerous times, so much mental abuse she had endured. As a matter of fact, despite all that, she had forgotten her true name, Bakhita, which what her slaves had given her, which seriously meant fortunate. She was then purchased by an Italian family and moved to Italy. Her lifestyle later changed there. When she went to Italy, things were different. For the first time in her life, people did not treat her as a piece of property, but as a human being. She was left with the Canossian Sisters, a group of Catholic nuns in Venice. They were not saints, but they were sympathetic. They welcomed her with kindness and gave her space to recover. Just think about it. Years of being beaten, of starving, of having been bought and sold like a commodity, and now because of a program, she was safe. And with individuals who had nothing in their pockets when they arrived to save the hope that perhaps she could be safe, that had to be wildly unrealistic change. As she lived with the sisters, Josephine wondered who they were and why they lived like they did. And she observed their faith in action, how they prayed, served, and interacted with one another. She started to ask questions like, Who was God? Who was this God they loved? Could he love someone like her? And she eventually chose to convert to Christianity. She was baptized, confirmed, and she received the name Josephine. It was a rebirth, as if her life had now just truly begun. And then she did something surprising. Instead of returning to a life of luxury with the family that had brought her to Italy, she chose to stay on with the sisters and join their order. As a Canossian sister, Josephine had a prayerful, simple, humble existence. She cooked, washed, and assisted in sewing tasks, which appeared insignificant but which were performed with great devotion. And visitors to her visited simply. They were attracted to her peacefulness, her cheerfulness, and her selflessness. Others who did not belong to her religion testified as much. And what makes the whole affair even more remarkable is that she was entitled to be angry and pretty much kind of just hate the world, but she didn't. She forgave her kidnappers, she forgave her torturers, and she forgave the man who stole her childhood. And she would tell them, if I had ever met those slave traders who abducted me, I would bow down and kiss their feet, because through men I met Christ. That kind of forgiveness is just kind of hard to imagine, but it is a really strong example of the power of real faith, and it's an example that God can take a broken life and make it beautiful. Let's go over some lessons from Saint Josephine. First, freedom isn't where you are. Even when she was still a slave, Josephine possessed something that people who treated her poorly didn't. That was the capacity to love. And when she finally did attain her freedom, she utilized her freedom not for revenge, but to serve. Second is forgiveness. That's the heavy lifting. We're all hurt by others, by things which have occurred by the world. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, though. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened or as though everything was all well. But Josephine shows that forgiveness is a real alternative, and that it does set us free too. Third is humility and joy. She had a quiet, not a flashy life. She wasn't about becoming popular nor becoming well known, but her quiet witness transformed the hearts of the thousands. She teaches us that sometimes being center stage doesn't necessarily show what a saint is. Indeed, that's what a believer must be at all times. It means doing all the behind the scenes work and things with great love, doing everything in integrity. Now let us reflect on the common strands which have been through the life of Saint Oscar Romero and Saint Josephine Bakhita. First, the issue of justice. Romero battled for justice on the public stage, in his sermons, even in his martyrdom. Bakhita's life, if less public, also wrestled with justice, in the act of loving and being respectful in the face of brutal injustice. One spoke with a microphone, and the other with an unwavering commitment to nonviolence. But both spoke amazingly loudly and made a large impact. And then comes the faith. Neither of these saints was a born easy faith kind of saint. They struggled and they suffered, but they held tight to God. Romero held tight to God in a world when death was threatened as a way to shatter his faith. Bakhita found faith after a lifetime of suffering and abuse, and she let God deliver her. Forgiving, we all talk about forgiving all the time, but how much do we ever actually mean it? Josephine forgave the individuals who kidnapped and raped her. Romero forgave the man and the woman who accused him and threatened him. Both of them demonstrate that forgiveness isn't weak, and that it's actually strong. Third and last, courage. Courage itself may not always appear the same. For Romero, it was preaching truth in the outside world. For Bakhita, it was living softly despite a life that abused her so deeply. We are reminded by the saints that courage is doing what's right, even when doing what's right may not always come naturally. Preaching about justice, or just loving when it's easier to hate. That's courage. It's still current today. You can say, why do I need saints? Their times are past. And what can they possibly bring to me now? But the answer is, All of them, they can all bring something now, and those narratives are ongoing. There are still trafficked people like Bakhita. There are still people silenced or murdered for speaking out, as was Romero. There are still systems of oppression and hatred cycles. We are a world that still cries out for another Romero and another Bakhita, men and women of truth, of justice, of love, and of compassion. They also remind us that we don't have to be perfect to become holy. Bakhita didn't even know about God until she became a teenager. Romero wasn't a prophet initially until later in life, but they did say yes to God when it counted. That was all that mattered. Their lives challenge us to ask themselves, how can I live my faith more completely? How can I advocate for the voiceless? How can I forgive even when it is difficult? The world doesn't need more celebrities or influencers, it needs more saints. The common people doing the extraordinary things in love, like these saints have. Oscar Romero and St. Josephine Bakhita lived in two completely separate worlds. He was a bishop of a war-torn country, and she a former slave turned into a nun. But while the two were vastly different, they chose a path of faith over fear, love over hate, and courage over silence. They weren't saints themselves in their nature, they simply followed Christ, openly and secretly, in protest and in prayer, with their tongues and through humble service. Their lives teach us that sainthood isn't just perfection, it's faithfulness, it's saying yes to God again and again, even when things just don't go the way we may want them to. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope that the lives of St. Oscar Romero and St. Josephine Bakhita challenge and inspire you, as they have inspired me. Thank you.